Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavai Tejasvina Vaditamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May the Divine Being look over us lovingly as a mother and father. May the Divine Being support and nourish us as a mother and father. May we have the strength and skill to study together the art of spirituality. May no misunderstandings arise amongst us. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all beings everywhere. So, good evening. As you probably know from the bulletin that was sent out, we're not going to read and discuss Swami Vivekananda's Jnana Yoga. We're going to read and then at the end discuss Swami Vivekananda's Christ the Messenger. It being that season, it seemed very appropriate to read this and offer you what the Swami had to say. So just a little background. I think all of you know all of this, but just in case. Swami Vivekananda first came to the West in 1893. Between 1893 and 1897, he traveled to many states of the United States and to England. Over these 4 years, Swamiji gave hundreds of public and private lectures and classes. In 1897, he returned to India, where he formally started the Ramakrishna order and established its headquarters at Belur Math. Then in 1899, he came back to the West. This talk was given to a Protestant congregation in Pasadena, California, on January the 7th, 1900. The title is Christ the Messenger. Now, I invite you to have a pencil and paper so that you can write down any thoughts or questions that you have, because I'm not going to stop, as is normally done. I'm not going to stop in the middle of the talk and invite comments and questions. I'm just going to read it straight through to the end. Christ the Messenger. The wave rises on the ocean, and there is a hollow. Again another wave rises, perhaps bigger than the former, to fall down again, similarly again to rise, driving onward. In the march of events, we notice the rise and fall, and we generally look toward the rise, forgetting the fall. But both are necessary and both are great. This is the nature of the universe. Whether in the world of our thoughts, the world of our relations in society, or in our spiritual affairs, the same movement of succession, of rises and falls is going on. Hence great predominances in the march of events. The liberal ideals are marshaled ahead to sink down, to digest, as it were, to ruminate over the past, to adjust, to conserve, to gather strength once more for a rise and a bigger rise. The history of nations also has ever been like that. The great soul, the messenger we are to study this afternoon, came at a period of the history of his race, which we may well designate as a great fall. We catch only little glimpses here and there of the stray records that have been kept of his sayings and doings. For verily it has been well said that the doings and sayings of that great soul would fill the world if they had all been written down. And the 3 years of his ministry were like one compressed, concentrated age, which it has taken 1900 years to unfold, and who knows how much longer it will take. Little men like you and me are simply the recipients of just a little energy. A few minutes, a few hours, a few years at best are enough to spend it all, to stretch it out, as it were, to its fullest strength. And then we are gone forever. But mark this giant that came. Centuries and ages passed. Centuries and ages pass, yet the energy that he left upon the world is not yet stretched out, nor yet expanded to its full. It goes on adding new vigor as the ages roll on. Now, what you see in the life of Christ is the life of all the past. The life of every man is, in a manner, the life of the past. It comes to him through heredity, through surroundings, through education, through his own reincarnation, the past of the race. In a manner, the past of the earth, the past of the whole world is there upon every soul. What are we in the present but a result? What are we in the present but a result, an effect in the hands of that infinite past? What are we but floating wavelets in the eternal current of events, irresistibly moved forward and onward and incapable of rest? But you and I are only little things, bubbles. There are always some great wave, there are always some giant waves in the ocean of affairs, and in you and me, the life of the past race has been embodied only a little. But there are giants who embody, as it were, almost the whole of the past, and who stretch out their hands for the future. These are the signposts, here and there, which point to the march of humanity. These are verily gigantic, their shadows covering the earth. They stand undying, eternal. As it has been said by the same messenger, no man has seen God at any time, but through the Son, and that is true. And where shall we see God but in the Son? It is true that you and I, and the poorest of us, the meanest even, embody that God, even reflect that God. The vibration of light is everywhere, omnipresent, but we have to strike the light of the lamp before we can see the light. The omnipresent God of the universe cannot be seen until he is reflected by these giant lamps of the earth, the prophets, the man gods, the incarnations, the embodiments of God. We all know that God exists, and yet we do not see him. We do not understand him. Take one of these great messengers of light, compare his character with the highest ideal of God that you ever formed. Compare his character with the highest ideal of God that you ever formed, and you will find that your God falls short of the ideal, and that the character of the prophet exceeds your conceptions. You cannot even form a higher ideal of God than what actually embodied, that what the actually embodied have practically realized and set before us as an example. I'm going to read that again because I read it so badly. You cannot even form a higher ideal of God than what the actually embodied have practically realized and set before us as an example. Is it wrong, therefore, to worship these as God? Is it a sin to fall at the feet of these man gods and worship them as the only divine beings in the world? If they are really actually higher than all our conceptions of God, what harm is there in worshiping them? Not only is there no harm, but it is the only possible and positive way of worship. However much you may try by struggle, by abstraction, by whatsoever method you like, still so long as you are a man in the world of men, still so long as you are a man in the world of men, your world is human, your religion is human, and your God is human. And that must be so. What is not practical enough to take up an actually existing thing? Who is not practical enough to take up an actually existing thing and give up an idea which is only an abstraction, which he cannot grasp and is difficult of approach except through a concrete medium? Therefore, these incarnations of God have been worshipped in all ages and in all countries. We are now going to study a little of the life of Christ, the incarnation of the Jews. When Christ was born, the Jews were in that state which I call a state of fall between two waves, a state of conservatism, a state where the human mind is, as it were, tired for the time being of moving forward and is taking care only of what it has already, a state when the attention is more bent upon particulars, upon details, than upon the great, general, and bigger problems of life, a state of stagnation rather than a towing ahead, a state of suffering more than of doing. Mark you, I do not blame this state of things. We have no right to criticize it, because had it not been for this fall, the next rise, which was embodied in Jesus of Nazareth, would have been impossible. I'm going to repeat that. Mark you, I do not blame this state of things. We have no right to criticize it, because had it not been for this fall, the next rise, which was embodied in Jesus of Nazareth, would have been impossible. The Pharisees and Sadducees might have been insincere. They might have been doing things which they ought not to have done. They might have been even hypocrites. But whatever they were, these factors were the very cause of which the messenger was the effect. These factors were the very cause of which the messenger was the effect. The Pharisees and Sadducees at one end were the very impetus which came out at the other end as the gigantic brain of Jesus of Nazareth. The attention to forms, to formulas, to the everyday details of religion, and to rituals may sometimes be laughed at, but nevertheless within them is strength. Many times in the rushing forward, we lose much strength. As a fact, the fanatic is stronger than the liberal man. Mm-hmm. Even the fanatic, therefore, has one great virtue. He conserves energy, a tremendous amount of it. As with the individual, so with the race, energy is gathered to be conserved. Hemmed in all around by external enemies, driven to focus in a center by the Romans. Now this is a very important section, so I'm going to start that again. Hemmed in all around by external enemies, driven to focus in a center by the Romans, by the Hellenic tendencies in the world of intellect, by waves from Persia, India, and Alexandria, hemmed in physically, mentally and morally, there stood the race with an inherent, conservative, tremendous strength, which their descendants have not lost even today. And the race was forced to concentrate and focus all its energies upon Jerusalem and Judaism. But all power, when once gathered, cannot remain collected. It must expend and expand itself. All power, when once gathered, cannot remain collected. It must expend and expand itself. There is no power on earth which can be kept long confined within a narrow limit. It cannot be kept compressed too long to allow of expansion as at a subsequent. It cannot be compressed too long to allow of expansion at a subsequent period. This concentrated energy amongst the Jews, amongst the Jewish race, found its expression at the next period in the rise of Christianity. The gathered streams collected into a body. Gradually, all the little streams joined together and became a surging wave on the top of which we find standing out the character of Jesus of Nazareth. Thus, every prophet is a creation of its own times, the creation of the past of his race. He himself is the creator of the future. The cause of today is the effect of the past and the cause for the future. In this position stands the messenger. The cause of today is the effect of the past and the cause for the future. In this position stands the messenger. In him is embodied all that is the best and greatest in his own race, the meaning, the life for which the race has struggled for ages. And he himself is the impetus for the future, not only to his own race, but to unnumbered other races of the world. We must bear another fact in mind, that my view of the great prophet of Nazareth would be from the standpoint of the Orient. Many times you forget also that the Nazarene himself was an Oriental of Orientals. With all your attempts to paint him with blue eyes and yellow hair, the Nazarene was still an Oriental. All the similes, the imageries in which the Bible is written, the scenes, the locations, the attitudes, the groups, the poetry and symbol speak to you of the Orient, of the bright sky, of the heat of the sun, of the desert, of the thirsty men and animals, of men and women coming with pitchers on their heads to fill them at the wells, of their flocks, of the plowmen, of the cultivation that is going on around, of the water mill and wheel, of the mill pond, of the millstones. All these are to be seen today in Asia. The voice of Asia has been the voice of religion. The voice of Europe is the voice of politics. Each is great in its own sphere. The voice of Europe is the voice of ancient Greece. To the Greek mind, his immediate society was all in all. Beyond that, it is barbarian. None but the Greek has the right to live. Whatever the Greeks do is right and correct. Whatever else there exists in the world is neither right nor correct, nor should be allowed to live. It is intensely human in its sympathies, intensely natural, intensely artistic, therefore. The Greek lives entirely in this world. He does not care to dream. Even his poetry is practical. His gods and goddesses are not only human beings, but intensely human, with all human passions and feelings almost the same as with any of us. He loves what is beautiful, but mind you, it is always external nature, the beauty of the hills, of the snows, of the flowers, the beauty of flowers and of figures, the beauty in the human face, and more often in the human form. That is what the Greeks liked. And the Greeks, being the teachers of all subsequent Europeanism, the voice of Europe is Greek. There is another type in Asia. Think of that vast, huge continent whose mountaintops go beyond the clouds, almost touching the canopy of heaven's blue. A rolling desert of miles upon miles, where a drop of water cannot be found, neither will a blade of grass grow. Interminable forests and gigantic rivers rushing down into the sea. In the midst of all these surroundings, the Oriental love of the beautiful and of the sublime developed itself in another direction. It looked inside and not outside. There is also the thirst for nature, and there is also the same thirst for power. There is also the same thirst for excellence, the same idea of the Greek and barbarian, but it has extended over a larger circle. In Asia, even today, birth or color or language never makes a race. That which makes a race is its religion. We are all Christians. We are all Mohammedans. We are all Hindus or all Buddhists. No matter if a Buddhist is a Christian, no matter if a Buddhist is a Chinaman or is a man from Persia, they think that they are brothers because of their possessing the same religion. Religion is the tie, unity of humanity. And then again, the Oriental, for the same reason, is a visionary, is a born dreamer. The ripples of the waterfalls, the songs of the birds, the beauties of the sun and the moon and stars and the whole earth are pleasant enough, but they are not sufficient for the Oriental mind. He wants to dream a dream beyond. He wants to go beyond the present. The present, as it were, is nothing to him. The Orient has been the cradle of the human race for ages, and all the vicissitudes of fortune are there. Kingdoms succeeding kingdoms, empires succeeding empires, human power, glory, and wealth, all rolling down there, a Golgotha of power and learning. This is the Orient, a Golgotha of power, of kingdoms, of learning. No wonder the Oriental mind looks with contempt upon the things of the world, and naturally he wants to see something that changeth not, something which which dieth not, something which in the midst of this world of misery and death is eternal, blissful, and undying. An Oriental prophet never tires of insisting upon these ideals. And as for prophets, you may also remember that without one exception, all the messengers were Orientals. We see, therefore, in the life of this area, we see, therefore, in the life of this area, messenger of life, the first watchword, not this life, but something higher. And like the true son of the Orient, he is practical in that. You people of the West are practical in your own department, in military affairs, and in managing political circles and other things. Perhaps the Oriental is not practical in those ways, but he is practical in his own field. He is practical in religion. If one preaches a philosophy, tomorrow there are hundreds who will struggle their best to make it practical in their lives. If a man preaches that standing on one foot would lead to salvation, he will immediately get 500 to stand upon one foot. You may call it ludicrous, but mark you, beneath that is their philosophy, that intense practicality. In the West, plans of salvation mean intellectual gymnastic. In the West, plans of salvation mean intellectual gymnastics. Plans which are never worked out, never brought into practical life. In the West, the preacher who talks the best is the greatest preacher. In the West, the preacher who talks the best is the greatest preacher. So we find Jesus of Nazareth, in the first place, the true Son of the Orient, intensely practical. He has no faith in this evanescent world and all its belongings. No need of text torturing, as is the fashion in the West in modern times. No need of no need of stretching out texts until they will not stretch anymore. Texts are not India rubber, and even that has its limits. Now, no making of religion is to pander to the sense of vanity of the present day. Now, no making of religion is to pander to the sense of vanity of the present day. Mark you, let us all be honest. If we cannot follow the ideal, let us confess our weakness, but not degrade it. Let not any try to pull it down. One gets sick at heart at the different accounts of the life of Christ that Western people give. I do not know what he was or what he was not. One would make him a great politician. One would make him a great politician. Another, perhaps, would make of him a great military general. Another, a great patriotic Jew, and so on. Is there any warrant in the books for all such assumptions? The best commentary on the life of a great teacher is his own life. Quote, "The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head." That is what Christ says as the only way to salvation. He lays down no other way. Let us confess in sackcloth and ashes that we cannot do that. We still have fondness for me and mine. We want property, money, wealth. Woe unto us. Let us confess and not put to shame the great teacher of humanity. He had no family ties. But do you think that man had any physical ideas in him? Do you think that this mass of light, this God and not man, came down to earth to be the brother of animals? And yet people make him preach all sorts of things. He had no sex ideas. He was a soul, nothing but a soul, just working a body for the good of humanity. And that was all his relation to the body. In the soul, there is no sex. The disembodied soul has no relationship to the animal, no relationship to the body. The ideal may be far away beyond us, but never mind, keep to the ideal. Let us confess that it is our ideal, but we cannot approach it yet. He had no other occupation in life, no other thought except that one, that he was a spirit. He was a disembodied, unfettered, unbound spirit. And not only so, but he, with his marvelous vision, had found that every man and woman, whether Jew or Gentile, whether rich or poor, whether saint or sinner, was the embodiment of the same undying spirit as himself. Therefore, the one work his whole life showed, therefore, the one work his whole life showed to all, therefore, the one work his whole life showed was to call upon them to realize their own spiritual nature. Give up, he says, these superstitious dreams that you are low and that you are poor. Think not that you are trampled upon and tyrannized over as if you were slaves. For within you is something that can never be tyrannized over, never be trampled upon, never be troubled, never be killed. You are all sons of God, immortal spirit. No, he declared, the kingdom of heaven is within you. I and my Father are one. Dare to stand up and say not only that, I am the Son of God, but I shall also find in my heart of hearts that I and my Father are one. That was what Jesus of Nazareth said. He never talks of this world and of this life. He has nothing to do with it, except that he wants to get hold of the world as it is, give it a push, and drive it forward and onward until the whole world has reached to the effulgent light of God, until everyone has realized his spiritual nature, until death is vanished and misery banished. We have read the different stories that have been written about him. We know the scholars and their writings and the higher criticism, and we know all that has been done by study. We are not here to discuss how much of the New Testament is true. We are not here to discuss how much of that life is historical. It does not matter at all whether the New Testament was written within 500 years of his birth, nor does it matter even how much of that life is true. But there is something behind it, something we want to imitate. To tell a lie, you have to imitate a truth, and that truth is a fact. You cannot imitate that which never existed. You cannot imitate that which you never perceived. You cannot imitate that which you never perceived. But there must have been a nucleus, a tremendous power that came down, a marvelous manifestation of spiritual power, and of that we are speaking. It stands there. Therefore, we are not afraid of all the criticisms of the scholars. If I, as an Oriental, have to worship Jesus of Nazareth, there is only one way left to me, that is to worship him as God and nothing else. Have we no right to worship him in that way? Do you mean to say, have we no right to worship him in that way, do you mean to say? If we bring him down to our own level and simply pay him a little respect as a great man, why should we worship at all? Our scriptures say, these great children of light who manifest the light themselves, who are light themselves, they being worshipped become, as it were, one with us, and we become one with them. I'm going to read that again. Our scriptures, by that he means the scriptures of India, say, those great children of light who manifest the light themselves, who are light themselves, they being worshipped, become, as it were, one with us, and we become one with them. For you see, in three ways man perceives God. At first, the undeveloped intellect of the uneducated man sees God as far away, up in the heavens somewhere, sitting on a throne as a great judge. He looks upon him as a fire, as a terror. Now that is good, for there is nothing bad in it. You must remember that humanity travels not. This is wonderful here. Now that is good, for there is nothing bad in it. You must remember that humanity travels not from error to truth, but from truth to truth. It may be, if you like it better, from lower truth to higher truth, but never from error to truth. Suppose you start from here and travel toward the sun in a straight line. From here, the sun looks only small in size. Suppose you go forward 1,000,000 miles. The sun will be much bigger. At every stage, the sun will become bigger and bigger. Suppose 20,000 photographs had been taken of the same sun from different standpoints. These 20,000 photographs will all certainly differ from one another. But can you deny that each is a photograph of the same sun? So all forms of religion, which are low, so all forms of religion, high or low, are just different stages toward that eternal state of light, which is God himself. Some embody a lower view, some a higher, and that is all the difference. Therefore, the religions of the unthinking masses all over the world must be, and have always been, of a God who is outside of the universe, who lives in heaven, who governs from that place, who is a punisher of the bad and a rewarder of the good, and so on. As man advanced spiritually, he began to feel that God was omnipresent, that he must be in him, that he must be everywhere, that he was not a distant God, but dearly the soul of all souls. As my soul moves my body, even so God is the mover of my soul. Soul within soul. And a few individuals who had developed enough and were pure enough went still further and at last found God. As the New Testament says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And they found God at last, that they and the Father were one. You find that all these three stages are taught by the great teacher in the New Testament. Note the common prayer he taught. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, and so on. A simple prayer, a child's prayer. Mark you, it is the common prayer because it is intended for the uneducated masses. To a higher circle, to those who had advanced a little more, he gave a more elevated teachings. I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. Do you remember that? To those who had advanced a little more, he gave a more elevated teachings. I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. Do you remember that? And then when the Jews asked him what he was, he declared that he and his Father were one, and the Jews thought that was a blasphemy. What did he mean by that? This has been also told by your old prophet. This is from Isaiah. Ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. Ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. It's in the Psalms also. Mark the same three stages. You will find that it is easier for you to begin with the first and end with the last. The messenger came to show the path, that the spirit is not in forms, that it is not through all sorts of vexations and lofty problems of philosophy that you know the spirit. Better that you had no learning. Better that you had never read a book in your life. These are not at all necessary for salvation. Neither wealth, nor position, nor power, nor even learning. But what is necessary is that one thing, purity. Blessed are the pure in heart, for the spirit in its own nature is pure. How can it be otherwise? It is of God. It has come from God. In the language of the Bible, it is the breath of God. In the language of the Quran, it is the soul of God. Do you mean to say that the Spirit of God can ever be impure? But alas, it has been, as it were, covered over with the dust and dirt of ages through our own actions, good and evil. Various works which were not correct, which were not true, have covered the same spirit with the dust and dirt of the ignorance of ages. It is only necessary to clear away the dust and dirt, and then the spirit shines immediately. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Where goest thou to seek for the kingdom of God? Asks Jesus of Nazareth, when it is there within you. Cleanse the spirit, and it is there. It is already yours. How can you get what is not yours? It is yours by right. You are the heirs of immortality, sons of the eternal Father. This is the great lesson of the messenger. And another, which is the basis of religions, is renunciation. How can you make the spirit pure? By renunciation. How can you make the spirit pure? By renunciation. A rich young man asked Jesus, "Good master, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said unto him, "One thing thou lackest. Go thy way, sell whatever thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have the treasures in heaven. And come, take up the cross, and follow me." And the young rich man was sad at that saying, and went away grieved, for he had great possessions. We are all more or less like that. The voice is ringing in our ears day and night. In the midst of our pleasures and joys, in the midst of worldly things, we think that we have forgotten everything else. Then comes a moment's pause, and the voice rings in our ears. Give up all that thou hast, and follow me. Whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life for my sake shall find it. For whoever gives up his life for his sake finds the life immortal. In the midst of all our weakness, there is a moment of pause, and the voice rings, give up all that thou hast, give it to the poor, and follow me. This is the one ideal he preaches, and this has been the ideal preached by all the great prophets of the world: renunciation. What is meant by renunciation? That is the only one ideal that there is. What is meant by renunciation? that there is only one ideal immortality. There is only one ideal in morality, unselfishness. Be selfless. The ideal is perfect unselfishness. When a man is struck on the right cheek, he turns the left also. When a man's coat is carried off, he gives away his cloak also. We should work in the best way we can without dragging the ideal down. Here is the ideal: when a man has no more self in him, no possession, nothing to call me or mine, has given himself up entirely, destroyed himself, as it were. In that man is God himself. For in him, self-will is gone, crushed out, annihilated. That is the ideal man. We cannot reach that state yet let us worship the ideal and slowly struggle to reach the ideal, though maybe with faltering steps. It may be tomorrow, or it may be 1,000 years hence, but that ideal has to be reached, for it is not only the end, but also the means. To be unselfish, perfectly selfless, is salvation itself, for the man within dies and God alone remains. One more point. All the teachers of humanity are unselfish. Suppose Jesus of Nazareth was teaching, and a man came and told him, "What you teach is beautiful. I believe that it is the way to perfection, and I'm ready to follow it. But I do not care to worship you as the only begotten Son of God." What would be the answer of Jesus of Nazareth? Very well, brother. Follow the ideal and advance in your own way. I do not care whether you give me the credit for the teaching or not. I am not a shopkeeper. I do not trade in religion. I only teach truth, and truth is nobody's property. Nobody can patent truth. Truth is God himself. Go forward. But what the disciples say nowadays is, no matter whether you practice the teachings or not, do you give credit to the man? If you credit the master, you will be saved. If not, there is no salvation for you. And thus the whole teaching of the master is degenerated. And all the struggle and fight is for the personality of the man. They do not know that in imposing that difference, they are, in a manner, bringing shame to the very man they want to honor, the very man that would have shrunk with shame from such an idea. What did he care if there was one man in the world that remembered him or not? He had to deliver his message, and he gave it. And if he had 20,000 lives, he would give them all up for the poorest man in the world. If he had to be tortured millions of times for 1,000,000 despised Samaritans, and if for every one of them the sacrifice of his own life would be the only condition of salvation, he would have given his life. And all this without wishing to have his name known even to a single person. Quiet, unknown, silent would be the world, would he. Oh, quiet, unknown, silent would the world, just as the Lord works. Now, what would the disciples say? He will tell you that you may have a perfect man, perfectly unselfish, but unless you give the credit to our teacher, to our saint, it is of no avail. Why? What is the origin of this superstition, this ignorance? The disciple thinks that the Lord can manifest himself only once. There lies the whole mistake. God manifests himself to you in man. But throughout nature, what appears once must have happened before and must happen in the future. There is nothing in nature which is not bound by law. And that means that whatever happens to one must go on and have been going on. In India, they have the same idea of the incarnations of God. One of their great incarnations, Krishna, whose grand sermon, the Bhagavad Gita, some of you might have read, says, "Though I am unborn, of changeless nature, and Lord of beings, yet subjugating my Prakriti, I come into being by my own Maya. Whenever virtue subsides and immorality prevails, then I body myself forth for the protection of the good, for the destruction of the wicked, and for the establishment of Dharma. I come into being in every age. Whenever the world goes down, the Lord comes to help. Whenever the world goes down, the Lord comes to help it forward." What on earth? I'm sorry, I lost the text. Gracious sakes. Whenever the world goes down, the Lord comes to help it forward. And so he does from time to time and place to place. In another passage, Krishna speaks to this effect. Whenever thou findest a great soul of immense power and purity struggling to raise humanity, know that he is born of my splendor, that I am there working through him. Let us therefore find God not only in Jesus of Nazareth, but in all the great ones that have preceded him, in all that came after him, and in all that are yet to come. Our worship is unbounded and free. They are all manifestations of the same infinite God. They are all pure and unselfish. They struggled and gave up their lives for us, poor human beings. They each and all suffer vicarious atonement for every one of us, and also for all that are to come hereafter. In a sense, you are all prophets. Every one of you is a prophet, bearing the burden of the world on your own shoulders. Have you ever seen a man? Have you ever seen a woman who is not quietly, patiently bearing her life burden, who is not quietly, patiently bearing his or her little burden of life? The great prophets were giants. They bore a gigantic world on their shoulders. Compared with them, we are pygmies, no doubt. Yet we are doing the same task in our little circles, in our little homes. We are bearing our little crosses. There is no one so evil, no one so worthless, but he has to bear his own cross. But with all our mistakes, with all our evil thoughts and evil deeds, there is a bright spot somewhere. There is still somewhere the golden thread through which we are always in touch with the divine. For know for certain that the moment the touch of the divine is lost, there would be annihilation. And because none can be annihilated, there is always somewhere in our heart of hearts, however low and degraded we may be, a little circle of light which is in constant touch with the divine. Our salutations go to all the past prophets whose teachings and lives we have inherited, whatever might have been their race, clime, or creed. Our salutations go to all those godlike men and women who are working to help humanity, whatever be their birth, color, or race. Our salutations to those who are coming in the future, living gods, to work unselfishly for our descendants. Well, we have 3 minutes left in the hour, but for anyone who wishes to discuss this, who wishes to ask a question or make a comment, please do. This was a joy to read, and I hope it was a joy to hear Swami Vivekananda speak about these things. Anyone at all?
Brother Shankara, this is Rishikesh. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you, sir. This was a very good read. I'm just wondering what must have been the reaction of the audience or later on by the scholars and everyone, if there was any further commentary on his great, you know, equalization, I should say, of perspective for everyone.
Rishikesh, he was very well received in Pasadena. There's no record of any reaction against this talk, except for one instance. There was a place called the Shakespeare Club. Mm-hmm. The Shakespeare Club was a club, I think it was a Tuesday afternoon club. I visited the place where it used to be. It's no longer there. It's now something else. He spoke at the Shakespeare Club, and it was an audience of women, the important women of Pasadena in their finery. And it would have been around the holidays because that's when he was speaking there. He stayed for 6 weeks in South Pasadena and spoke in December and January in Pasadena and Los Angeles. And in the Shakespeare Club on that afternoon, the Swami told these women that they held the station they had in life because there were women of the street, and they should worship the women of the street because it was through their sacrifice, their lives being lived in the way that they lived their lives, that these women had their fine mansions on Fair Oaks and Orange Avenue and so on. A great number of them got up and left, and he was not invited to their homes anymore. That was the only time that there's a record of his being treated in that way. And someone asked about it, and he said, "Oh, don't worry. In New York, I have emptied whole halls." And that was true also.
Brother Shankara.
Yes, Uma.
Question. Was there any reaction to Swamiji's claim that Christ was Oriental? Because
I know of no record of any reaction against it. I mean, it's undeniable. This is one of the things that is still an issue. Christ was a Jew.
Yeah.
Christ was a son of Nazareth.
Yes.
He was of the house of David. He was an Oriental of the Near East, but nevertheless of the Orient. So I've no doubt that there were some people whose feathers were ruffled by this,
Yeah.
because they so love their images of Christ, which have come down to us primarily through the Romans and the Renaissance, and the later painters. But I mean, one didn't want to get into a dispute with Swami Vivekananda. Margaret Noble later became became Sister Nivedita. She tried that in London. She really crossed swords with him there because she was trained in Christian mythology and philosophy and theology, and she ended up becoming his closest disciple.
Yes, thank you.
That brings up something that was very interesting to me. He said, religion makes race. And I find that interesting in several ways. One, that, I don't have to have a particular color skin in order to believe in a particular religion or something, but that it would bond people together. But also kind of what you're saying, Emma, which is that other thing where we have the self and the other. There's the ones like me, the ones that believe in my religion, but then there's the other, and somehow Swamiji was able to get through some of that. And I think that's what I hope for, at least, is some way, because even today, I think a lot of our wars, most of our wars, our world problems are based on that smaller truth, the bigger, somehow, if we could remember that it's bigger than that.
Well, Sarah Jane, you're absolutely right. And the screen that is being looked at this moment is an absolute objectification of that. We are all sharing a spiritual path. And look at the diversity of people that are here. And if you look across the country, in the various parts of the country, Tucson, Arizona, for example, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Phoenix, Arizona, Southern California, you'll find people many people of the Hispanic lineages that are practicing Vedantists. And we have people of color in this congregation, bless us. And so, yes, it is religion that truly binds people together. The Spirit binds us together. Thank you, Sarah Jane, for that insight and for catching the Swami in those moments. Anyone else?
Brother Shankara?
Yes. Yes, Sarah.
This is a little book with great wisdom, Brother Shankara. I read it 3 times. This is the 3rd. It's really, really nice. That's all I wanted to comment. Extremely.
Yes, it has been published as a separate book.
Yes.
Christ the Messenger.
So much wisdom.
And it really, if you want to know what Swamiji really thought about Christ, it's in this. Oh, I'm going to tell a funny story.
Yes.
It's funny to me anyway. Swami traveled to this talk by horse carriage. On the way back, he was living with the Mead sisters, with their family, eight other people in a small house in South Pasadena. When they left the lecture hall and were headed back, now mind you, this was around Christmas, in the Christmas season, and so, And the Swami had spoken on Christ. And he was on the way back. Mrs. Mead noticed that he was in deep thought, deep thought. So, and he was just vibrating as Swamiji would with the intensity of his concentration. And she didn't dare to interrupt him. She thought, oh, he's immersed in his contemplation of Christ. And, he's just continuing with that. And finally, about 3/4 of the way home, and it was, the Swami was thinking about it a long time, he finally said, aha, I've got it, I've got it. And Mrs. Mead said, what, Swami? And he said, it's the bay leaf. It's the bay leaf they used to flavor the mulligatawny soup. Mrs. Mead said she about fell out of the carriage with laughter.
That is so funny.
That is fun. And, that's Swamiji, whatever he was focusing on. He was going through in his mind how mulligatawny soup is prepared in each ingredient. And finally he got, aha, that's it. It's the bay leaf.
But that proves that he was human, just like
Oh, yes, of course. Oh, Lord, that Mead family said, oh, the Swami is a terror in the kitchen. He says that he's fixing food that isn't spicy and it still burns our throats. And he uses every pot and pan in the house.
most men do. Most men do.
So anyway, it was quite a cleanup project when Swami would fix them a meal.
That's
Anything else from anyone?
I was thinking about the point towards the end about teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And what he says, all the teachers of humanity are unselfish.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that it's not a transaction, which is often what teaching becomes in today's world.
Mm-hmm.
The sense that, even this idea of plagiarism that we have in, say, the academic world today.
Mm-hmm.
It's this idea that behind it all is this sense of shopkeeping, which is a struggle.
Yes.
And the example of Jesus and his example of teaching, it reminds me of what Sri Ramakrishna says to the Brahmo Samaj, or to Keshav Sen. He said, teach without thinking of yourself as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the hardest thing. It's the hardest thing, because you're always thinking, oh, my student must need me or something. But they don't depend on you.
Yes.
It's all in them already.
Education has degraded a great deal since the medieval schoolmen. There's no two ways about it.
So I'm just wondering what it would mean to apply this ideal, since we shouldn't tear down the ideal, as he says, even if we can't reach it ourselves. How to teach without teaching in the way that Swamiji does.
If you go again to Sri Ramakrishna and what he teaches in the gospel, which is meant for our instruction, on virtually every page, every other page at least, are the phrases, God alone is the doer. God is the truth, all else is an illusion. God alone is real, all else is an illusion. So for us to become successful at the way that you just described, Divya, is to do our best to first take a stand for that. I am not the doer, God alone is the doer. Whether we really know it or not, whether we really believe it in our heart of hearts or not, first take a stand for it so that we think, okay, this is the way I will deal with the situations that arise from this truth that I've been taught. And then slowly and slowly doing that manana, that's what taking the stand for it and thinking about it in that way, that's the manana part. Slowly you become convinced of the truth of it. Then you begin to practice what in Advaita is called nididhyasana. And nididhyasana is insistence on that truth. That no matter how it seems to us, no matter how the situation develops, no matter what happens, we think, well, this is the will of God.
Yes.
And so it's a long road of winding, but it is something that is both possible and very practical. It's practical because it frees us.
Yes.
It frees us.
And in a contradictory way too, because it makes us realize that, you know, what we call free will doesn't quite exist as we think it does. I mean, we are free, of course, but it's God's will working through us.
It's Sri Ramakrishna says it's not possible to understand intellectually. It's simply not possible to understand intellectually. We have to go to the spiritual center of our being and find God. And he says, when you come into the neighborhood of God, all of these contradictions, paradoxes, and problems resolve themselves. And once again, is this possible? Every one of the great teachers says it's not only possible, it's the most practical thing for us to do. Because it's impractical to rely on the world. This action and experience suit we're in doesn't last long. And really, if we stop and think about it, it possesses nothing. Because at the end, it simply disappears. It simply stops functioning. And everything that it thought, if it had the thought that it belonged or owned anything belonged to it or it owned anything, where did that go? So nothing. The simple little story that I just love to remember is after World War II, one of Swami Prabhavananda's disciples, a woman, very sincere, very devout, I'm told. I never met her. She'd passed on by the time I came. But she had become the Swami's disciple before the war and had a job where she made enough to live on, but just barely. During the war, when women became more a part of the workforce and their talents and capabilities became apparent to employers, that they had, in any event, to cut to the chase, after the war, she ended up having a job where she made considerably more money. And one time in class, she asked Swami Prabhavananda, Swami, I'm now making more money. Should I have a bank account? And he said, oh, yes, please have a bank account, have plenty bank account. Just remember, the money is not yours, it is Sri Ramakrishna's. So this is the ideal, that no matter what comes to us, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the divine, the creator, the sustainer, and transformer. And so that's true of this relationship with students too, Divya. It's not my relationship. I'm the servant. I'm the actor here.
Not I, but thou.
Go ahead, please, Divya.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying the principle of not I, but thou.
Exactly. If you ask any of the Swamis, if you poke them, any of the Swamis, they'll say something like, I am only a face of Sri Ramakrishna, or in some cases, they'll say of Mother.
Brother Shankara,
Yes, dear.
could you explain to me? He said Jesus Christ was a Jew, but then Umaji pointed out that he was an Oriental. I don't
The
understand.
Jews are Orientals.
Pardon?
The Jews are Orientals.
Okay, so what does Oriental mean? I mean, when
People of the Orient. The Orient starts in the Mideast. It may actually start, well, nevertheless, it's definitely starts in the Near East. And then there's the Near East and the Far East, and they're all Orientals, as opposed to Occidentals, people of Europe, which starts at Greece.
oh, okay.
I mean, just look at the Jewish people. They don't look like Europeans at all. They don't have fair skin. They don't have blonde hair. There may be Jewish people that, because of the mixing of races, although the Jews are been very careful about this over the millennia. They have been very careful. It's not a widely accepted thing particularly among the Orthodox Jews, for someone to marry outside the Jewish community. So they remain swarthy, dark-haired, dark-eyed,
Small.
relatively small, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add on that point about the Orient, our conception of the Orient kind of has shifted in the modern period, because in the ancient times it encompassed Egypt as well.
Oh, yes.
And of course, the Jews came from Egypt. Moses led them out of
Yes.
Egypt. So like if you look at I was looking at some of the coffins of the ancient Jews, and they look like sarcophagi.
Exactly. Exactly.
And even our own like Christian coffins are based on that.
And if you look at what happened, even with the when Moses went on the mount and came back down with the commandments, and they had created a god to worship, this golden god, it was an Egyptian god. That's where they came from. They were slaves. I mean, Moses was a Messiah. Moses was a messenger, and he gathered a following of people who were enslaved in Egypt and led them out of Egypt and And it was not, if you read Genesis, it was a bumpy ride. It was not an, but if you read when Aaron becomes jealous of Moses and asks God, then you see in God's response to Aaron that the relationship between Moses and the Father was the one of an avatar, of an incarnation. Anything else, delighted ones?
I found it really helpful when you said that about the bank account. Because when I was younger, I used to think, oh, well, I'll just give everything to everybody else. But that isn't very practical in kind of a karmic way of existence. You have to pay the rent, and you have to, I have kids, I have to feed my children. It would not be a good plan if I gave away all of my things today. Maybe someday I can get to a point that's closer than that. But that was so useful because as I was listening to this renunciation, and I'm always trying to figure out what that would mean personally.
Well,
that is a way that puts it into something that I can understand so much clearer. Like, so that was very clear, crystal clear. I appreciated that.
Oh, wonderful. And remember, it was Swami, I was simply quoting Swami Prabhupada. He was almost always crystal clear. And this business, if we study these wonderful Vedic idea of the 4 houses of life, the student phase, the householder phase, the retirement phase, vanaprashta, where we release our worldly attachments and turn them over to our children and to the next generation. And then the final phase of life where we pursue nothing but God realization. Sri Ramakrishna, of course, taught you can begin your emphasis on that 4th house now, even while you're doing the others. And he highly recommended that. And that's exactly the same thing that Christ said. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all else shall be added unto you. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all else shall be added unto you. But, as Swami Vivekananda pointed out in this talk and in many places, we must never compromise the ideal. We must just acknowledge I'm not yet capable. I'm not yet ready to live that ideal. And so we're not hypocrites. We're not falsely pious. We're not anything. We simply say, I acknowledge the ideal. I hold the ideal. I cherish the ideal, but I'm not yet able to live that ideal. And this is why Swami Sri Dharananda, beautiful Swami that he is, Swami Sri Dharananda is responsible now for the work in Australia and New Zealand. I'm told he's in his 90s. I thought he was still in his 80s, but I'm told now he's in his 90s. And what he says is, and so lovingly he says, oh, and he calls everyone my dear. It doesn't matter whether he's talking to the Prime Minister of India or to a street sweeper. He calls everyone my dear. He says, my dears, we must understand this is a long journey. It happens slowly and slowly. It cannot be hurried. It's slowly and slowly, but keep working at it. Keep up the struggle, as Swami Vivekananda says. So yes, Sarah Jane, you're right. You cannot, when Christ was talking to the rich young man, He wasn't saying that he wanted him to become someone who lived in the gutter, just to give away the excess wealth that he had. Just give that to the poor. And, he didn't expect his disciples to starve to death, though he himself said he had nowhere to lay his head.
Well, and somehow, if we all lived by the ideal, it would be on earth, as it is in heaven, but that isn't the case. And so, yeah, exactly. I that's a really interesting, very interesting.
Well, the Buddhists had a run at it. And what it did was it led to an hyperabundance of monastics and not enough people to sustain society.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's one of the reasons that Buddhism is no longer much practiced in India itself. It got a bad reputation for excess.
Brother Shankara,
Yes, dear.
yes, you can, dear. Good, thank you. The idea of renunciation, that's so beautifully put in the first verse of Isha Upanishad, the very first verse. And I'm not saying in Sanskrit so that all people can understand that whatever there is in this world is enveloped by God, pervaded by God. So whatever you have, feel free to enjoy it, but with the idea of renunciation, that any time it can be taken away, that any time, if you know that this does not belong to you, but to God, then you don't have to give up things if you cannot, if you're not ready. But when you are enjoying it, enjoy it thoroughly. But always in the back of your mind, remember that it does not, you are not the owner of that, that it
Yes.
doesn't belong to you.
Yes.
Be ready to give it up.
Because it's going to be given up, whether
Yeah.
you like it or not.
Yes.
No matter what you may think or what your attachments are.
Yeah.
All your attachments are doing is guaranteeing that you'll have another lifetime for you to learn not to have attachments. That's what we're told about reincarnation, and Holy Mother says this so explicitly. Sri Sharada Devi. If you want to be born again, just be attached to things, and that'll guarantee it.
And
Krishna says it in the Gita with great explicitness.
yes, and Mahatma Gandhi loved that first verse of Isha Upanishad because of this idea of renunciation.
Well, each of the Upanishads has its great verses and its great moments.
Yes.
The great forest Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Yajnavalkya talking to his wife Maitreyi,
Yes.
and reminding us that the only reason we're drawn to anything is because it is a manifestation of the self. No matter how it seems to us, it's a manifestation of the self. And so we're drawn to it because of that. Even those people who are drawn to their wealth, they're misunderstanding what it is that they're seeing. And that's why when Swami Vivekananda was approached by John D. Rockefeller who had, according to his doctors, he had about 14 weeks to live at the time. That was the best estimate that they could come up with. His body was deteriorating rapidly. This was the famous Rockefeller, the one who founded the Rockefeller fortune. And he went to Vivekananda and he said, well, I'm told that you're very wise. What should I do? And Vivekananda said, well, create a way in which to give away all of your wealth. That's what you should do. And of course, Rockefeller fussed at him a bit, but Vivekananda prevailed. Rockefeller went away, and in a number of weeks, I've forgotten the number of weeks, he came back and he threw some documents down in front of Vivekananda and said, you should thank me. And Vivekananda didn't say anything. He just slowly looked through the documents. And then he looked up and said, no, you should thank me. And Rockefeller went on to live for a number of years after that because his relief was so great that he had created the Rockefeller Foundation. I mean, the idea of the Rockefeller Foundation was Swami Vivekananda's idea. And that's not mythology, that's not hagiography, that's not apocryphy, that is an actual fact.
That's a beautiful story, Brother Shankara.
It is a beautiful story. And
so he lived more than the 14 days then. He lived
14
several years after.
Weeks. He was 14 weeks, not 14 days. 14, his doctors, as their best estimate, was that he would live 14 weeks. And he lived for many years afterward.
Is that because he had peace of mind?
We can imagine. We don't know. We don't know what happened. We don't exactly know why. His doctors were confounded, I can tell you that. That's the story. His doctors were confounded because he began to get better from what was ailing him. Somebody has their mic open and we're hearing them talk in the background.
Brother Shankara?
Yes, dear.
Sometime back there was a little bit of the discussion about the free will. I think this story in Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna's example of the cow that is tied with a rope.
Mm-hmm.
That is such a wonderful thing to remember.
The calf, not the cow.
Yeah, the calf.
The calf is tied with a rope to a stake,
right.
And
So,
it can only move about within the circle, and the cow is free to go.
Okay. So somewhere I also read that once the calf has exhausted that much of the limit that it can extend with the rope, then the cowherd gives it a different place to graze. So likewise, when we have exhausted the free will, then God gives us the grace to go beyond, something like that.
Yes, it's a lovely story. It's another one of Sri Ramakrishna's parables that's so powerful. The reason we don't have free will like the parent, the cow is the divine. It represented that divine being has wisdom. We don't have much wisdom, so we don't have much free will. That's the point of that story. And the saints in that book, Love Poems from God, all of them in their own way say God alone is the doer.
The real doer. I have plenty of self-will that I'd love to get rid of that you know, I guess ultimately it all is. It all is.
All you have to ask yourself over and over again, Sarah Jane, is who is this I? Who is this? Who is speaking? Who is thinking they have will? Who is this? And ultimately, we have to come to the conclusion that it is the Atman. And it's a very comforting conclusion to reach. So it isn't like you have to do that. It isn't that you must do that. But if we want to be rid of the delusion, that's the way to do it. And keep reading the things over and over again that remind us, like Krishna in chapters 2 through 6 of the Gita.
Yeah.
We can't read that too often.
Yeah.
Anything else, my dears? All right. Om Asato Ma Satkamaya. Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya. Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Abir Moiti. O dearly beloved, lead us from thy lesser apparent truth to thy highest eternal truth. Lead us from darkness and ignorance to the brilliance of thy wisdom and love. Lead us from darkness and ignorance to the brilliance of thy wisdom and love. Lead us from death to immortality. Light us through and through, light us through and through with thy everlasting, shining presence. Om. Amen. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace. Peace be unto us and to all beings everywhere.
Good night.
Jai Shri Guru Maharaj Ji Ki Jai. Durga, Durga, Durga. May you go forward in Mother's loving and protective embrace. May you be safe. May you be healthy. May you be cheerful. May you have peace of mind.
Thank you, Brother Shid.
Thank you.
Mara.
All of us that wish to will gather tomorrow evening, sometime right around 7:30, for the Christmas Eve service, which is a very simple, short worship, and then the reading of the Annunciation and Nativity of Christ, the Annunciation of the birth of Christ to Mary, and it ends with the. And it goes quickly, but it's a very sweet, and we sing some Christmas carols along with it. So it's a very sweet Christmas Eve service. And the Lord only knows all the wonderful people who have been bringing things and leaving them here for us to offer to the Lord tomorrow night. We just have so much to offer. So just sweet. So Jai Shri
Mara.
Maharaj Ki Jai.
Hari Om.
Hari Om, Hari Om. Good night, all.
Good night.